Now the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and teachers of the law were looking for some sly way to arrest Jesus and kill him, but not during the feast, they said, or the people may riot. With these first 2 verses of chapter 14 in the Gospel of Mark, I welcome you to another tidbit. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. We're looking at chapter 14 in the Gospel of Mark. It is a tremendous and rich chapter. There's a reason I call this Tidbits. It's impossible to cover it all. The verses that we read are followed directly in verse 10. Then Judas Iskariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. And in between, because you could actually read these verses, the 2 first and then verse 10 and 11 in sequence, in between there is a story told about a woman who anoints Jesus, the anointing in Bethany. It is called a sandwich story because it's sandwiched in between these 2 descriptions of the betrayal of Judas. Now there are several such sandwich stories in the Gospel of Mark. One of them, most famous, the sandwich story about the woman with bleeding, sandwiched in between the healing of the daughter of Jairus. So, in a similar way, the death of and execution of John the Baptist is sandwiched in between Jesus sending out the disciples and the disciples returning to report what they have experienced. So, a sandwich story most often will make a parallel, sometimes a contrasting parallel between 2 main characters or 2 main movements. And so it is here. We have 2 main persons in the woman and in Judas Iskariot. Let's read on in chapter 14 from verse 3. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of a man known as Simon the leper, that is, reclining in a sense, they were eating because they were lying when they were eating. A woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Now, it was extremely costly. This perfume, nard, came from the Himalayas, close to Nepal. It was costly. We will see how much a little later. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. 300 denarii and more, that would be 1 year's wages. That's quite a cost. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with me, and you can help them anytime you want." Now Jesus is here quoting from Deuteronomy. It's part of the law, the requirement to help the poor. There is a certain irony in what Jesus says, because it is true that there will always be poor, we should take care of them. But those people to whom he spoke, they were not very eager to do that actually. "But you will not always have me," he continues. "She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial." And she's the only one doing that. Later in chapter 16, when the women come to the tomb of Jesus with their oils and the anointing perfume, Jesus is already risen. So this woman is the only one who prepares Jesus for his burial. And notice, in order to do so, she must have had an understanding of the prophecies he had given about his crucifixion and resurrection, which the disciples, by the way, had a hard time to grasp. I tell you the truth, Jesus said, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. And that's the first of many prophecies in this chapter. Now, just a few words about the event that is sandwiched in between here. When Mark and also when Matthew says, while he was in Bethany, it may imply that it's not told in chronological order, and so it is. Going to John 12, you will find that this happens 6 days before Passover. Why is it told here? Because it's a good place for Mark to tell this story as a contrast to not only Judas Iskariot, but actually also a contrast to the attitude and actions of the other disciples. This woman stands out as a genuine disciple of Jesus in the moment of a crisis where one disciple is going to betray him and the others are fleeing, and one of his most trusted disciples will deny that he knows him. So this chapter speaks quite a lot about discipleship. Let's get an overview of what happens in the chapter. But before that, there's one small sentence I want to highlight from the anointing in Bethany. That is this sentence, and they rebuked her harshly. If you compare with the other Gospels and their account of the event, this is unique to Mark. Matthew is concerned with the disciples. John is concerned with Judas Iskariot. Luke, who writes to a rich man, he's concerned with the rich host, Simon the leper. Mark is concerned with the small and insignificant people, the unnamed woman. They rebuked her harshly. And I know that could mean that they spoke critical about her without her knowing. I don't think that really holds up to scrutiny. Why should Jesus then say, leave her alone? They are actually attacking her. They rebuked her, and Jesus came to her rescue. The remainder of the chapter, which is long and rich in content, goes as follows. There's a description of the Lord's Supper, preparation for the supper, a prophecy about the betrayal and the meal itself. Then you move towards Gethsemane. There is a prophecy about the betrayal of Peter, or the denial of Peter. And then Jesus is taken to the Sanhedrin, where he gives another prophecy, responding to the high priest. We find that in verse 60 to 62. Let me read here. The high priest said to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus. And then the prophecy, "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." So, another of the themes you can find in this chapter, we spoke about the theme of discipleship, comparing the various disciples. Another theme is prophecy and fulfillment. Jesus gives a prophecy about the woman and the story of the woman that would be told all through the world. He gives a prophecy about Judas, who's going to betray him. It is fulfilled. He gives a prophecy about Peter, who will deny him. It is fulfilled. He gives a prophecy about his death on the cross. You find that in the description of the Lord's Supper, when Jesus says in verse 21, "The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. That prophecy is fulfilled in the following chapters. But then you have this prophecy spoken to the high priest. Prophecy about Jesus coming as a just. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. Now, the other prophecies are all fulfilled, assuring you and me that this one will be fulfilled as well. The main prophecy is about the death of Jesus on the cross, and that is compared to a cup, a baptism. And we find that in the establishment of the Lord's Supper, in during the meal. And Jesus sits with his disciple at the table, and then while they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and said to his disciple, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is," he said, "my blood of the covenant." The phrase is actually taken from a prophecy in Zechariah chapter 9:11 that follows the description of the humble peace king arriving in Jerusalem. And the theme, the expression of the cup, is repeated later when Jesus prays in Gethsemane. He asked his Father, "Abba, Father," he said in verse 36, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Evidently, the cup is here symbolic. When Jesus gave his disciples, he had not died yet. They didn't drink his blood, literally speaking. The cup is his death on the cross. And here, the whole of Mark has a turning point. Until then, Jesus has been in charge. He has healed, he has taught. He has cleansed the temple of all the merchants. Now he says to God, "Not what I will, but what you will." And from this moment on, Jesus is passive. He lets humans take him, torture him, crucify him. But notice, this passivity is a matter of choice. It's voluntary. He is not forced to make his sacrifice. It's a voluntary sacrifice. But Jesus, who has been the active, the person in control, in charge, is now the passive receiver of the evil of humanity, of the sins of the world that he takes upon himself. Jesus will be crucified as that sacrifice. And that will be the theme for our next tidbit as we move into chapter 15. Thank you for listening. Always welcome back in our study of the Gospel of Mark.